Welcome, everybody. Glad you could join us tonight. Welcome to the monthly meeting of our nonprofit plant-based nutrition organization of Wisconsin, or PB Now. I'm your host, Terry Lynch. The mission of our nonprofit group is to educate, inspire, and support each other on an evidence-backed, whole food or whole plant food-based nutritional path for a healthier, happier, and actually less expensive life. Our group is open to everyone, those plant-based and those just curious about it, and it's meant to be a non-judgmental place to get information, inspiration, and support. If you'd like more information about our group, our upcoming meeting dates, speakers, and resources, or to check out videos of our past meetings, just Google us at PBNOW. As we do each time, can I see a show of hands or a thumbs up icon to show how many of you are currently following a predominantly plant-based lifestyle? Here we go. That's great. Thank you, everybody. As we mentioned at the beginning of each meeting, the evidence of the benefits of plant-based nutrition in improving health and quality of life for people of all ages, as published in non-biased medical research, is quite striking. Whether it's improving health through increased energy, weight loss, strengthening our immune system, preventing, slowing, stopping, reversing problems like allergies, digestive problems, diabetes, heart disease, and early dementia, or increasing our quality of life by helping us feel better quickly, increasing our endurance, improving athletic performance, speeding recovery from exercise, reducing joint pain, clearing thinking, reducing the physical, emotional, and financial side effects of illnesses, drugs, and procedures, often recommended to treat the conditions plant-based nutrition can help us avoid. The research shows that our bodies do a wonderful job of healing themselves if we stop inadvertently damaging them daily with poor nutrition and start giving them the nutrition they need to heal and function optimally. And we'll be hearing a lot about that tonight. It's truly remarkable. Now, let me tell you what's in store for you tonight. Tonight, we'll hear from two speakers, and we'll be flip-flopping a little bit. Our PBL Medical Director, Dr. Liberman, will be following our featured speaker, Dr. Andrew Freeman. After the presentations, if time allows, we'll have Q&A. And don't hesitate to pop your questions in the chat box as we go along during the presentations. We'll try to answer as many of them as time permits at the end. Tonight's program should end about 7:30. As a reminder, we have meetings nearly every month, usually on the second Thursday of the month, and usually at 6 p.m. Central Time.
Come on, Lola.
Next month, we'll hear, if everybody can please mute. Next month, we'll hear pulmonologist and sleep doctor, Dr. Jay Balachandran, and plant-based coach, Michelle Stam, along with our medical director, Dr. Joshua Liberman. In the future, we'll be hearing from a number of speakers, Anna Jane Esselstyn, among others. We'll post more information about our upcoming meetings on our website, pbnow.org. If you register on the website or already registered, you'll receive email reminders of our events as they approach. Last, a quick technical note. During the meeting, everyone but the speakers will be muted, and we ask that you stay muted to avoid background noise and to allow everyone to hear the speakers. With that, let's get to our featured speaker tonight. Our featured speaker tonight is a summa cum laude graduate of Cornell University and a research honors graduate of SUNY at Buffalo School of Medicine and Biomedical Science. He did his residency in internal medicine at Brown University, Rhode Island Hospital, and a fellowship in cardiology at Temple University in Philadelphia. He is director of cardiovascular prevention and wellness and director of clinical cardiology and operations at National Jewish Health in Denver, Colorado. He's also assistant professor of medicine at the University of Colorado, Denver. He's part of the leadership of both the local and national American College of Cardiology and has been nicknamed the vegan cardiologist. A number of you have seen him in past years give us his excellent annual review of the prior year's trove of plant-based nutritional research. As he has noted, the number of studies being published every year showing evidence of the benefits of plant-based nutrition grows larger and larger every year. Here tonight with his latest review is our featured speaker, Dr. Andrew Freeman. Dr. Freeman?
All right, well, thank you so much for having me. Appreciate it. Let's see here. Okay, good. So I hope everyone can see my screen.
Yes.
Good. All right, well, tonight, for those of you that haven't seen me speak before, I typically try to go through and show the world all the amazing plant-based nutrition information that you might have missed. And so hopefully tonight you'll walk away with that great information. And my disclosures. And then, of course, as a reminder that there are many well-done randomized trials showing the efficacy of plant-based diets in improving health outcomes. There are some studies that are observational, do not show cause, but show significant relationships. And then also, before I go too far, just a reminder to everyone that you can certainly get more than enough protein by eating plant-based foods. And for those of you that are worried, your favorite spinach, kale, and broccoli actually have more protein pound for pound, of course, dry weight than beef or chicken. So plenty of protein, so don't worry. So I always like to start with some statistics. Each year, a variety of professional societies do a lot of work to gather statistics. And it turns out that the American Heart Association now predicts that about 61% of US adults will be diagnosed with some type of cardiovascular disease by 2050, which means people like me and Dr. Liberman will be in business for a long time to come. And it's mostly attributed to Americans with high blood pressure and increasing population diversity. And the cost to the US will be almost $2 trillion in direct healthcare costs and productivity losses by 2050. Diabetes will jump to about 27%, obesity to about 61%. And it turns out that poor diet is still tops of the charts with a prevalence that will go up to probably closer to 70% by 2050. And it turns out that all the usual culprits, inadequate physical activity, sleep, and smoking actually are still present even all the way into 2050. It also starts with children. If you take a look at what's going on with children, you'll see that health factors like obesity are on the rise and continue to be on the rise, and all of the health behaviors like we always talk about, poor diet as well. And if that's not enough, you may be surprised to learn, but nearly half of Americans have something called fatty liver or metabolic associated steatotic liver disease, which can actually lead to liver fibrosis and cirrhosis, but also typically precedes things like diabetes. And again, a lot of this has to do with our diet. And if you look at this interesting study that looked at this particular disease entity, about 15,000 studies from Tianjin, the highest tertiles of the Eat Lancis diet, which is a more plant-based and whole food diet, had a markedly lower risk of fatty liver compared with those in the lowest tertiles, up to about third less. And then it turns out that as you look through the data that has been posted in the last year or so, this was an interesting study that shows in 5,000 women from the New York University Women's Health Study, the bottom quartile of the DASH diet, another plant-based diet, actually had more cognitive complaints versus women in the top quartile of the DASH diet. And the authors conclude that a greater adherence to the DASH diet in midlife was associated with lower prevalence of life subjective cognitive complaints. So it turns out that what we eat now actually has an effect on our brains, especially later in life. And then there's been a lot of work in the last year on Alzheimer's disease. This one from my good colleague and friend, Dr. Dean Ornish, 51 Alzheimer's disease patients that were enrolled around age 74 years old. And it turns out that when they made comprehensive lifestyle changes, they had improvements or stabilization in nearly 2/3 of the treatment group participants and those who adhered most consistently to the diet. Meanwhile, 2/3 of those who made no changes had worsened cognitive functioning. Another interesting study that comes out of the nurses' health study and the health professionals follow-up study. This one was on olive oil. It was assessed every 4 years. And it turns out that if you consume at least 7 grams a day of olive oil, you had a 28% lower risk of dementia-related death compared to never or rarely consuming olive oil, just about a tablespoon. And it turns out that even if you had a genetic predisposition, that is elevated genetics in something called ApoE, which makes you more likely to develop cognitive dysfunction. And if you can replace 5 grams a day of margarine or mayonnaise with the equivalent amount of olive oil, you had a significant risk of less dementia-based mortality up to about 14%, so pretty powerful. And then, as you may know, all it takes is a quick tour to the local gas station, grocery store, wherever you might go. Everywhere you go is ultra-processed foods everywhere. And in this interesting study, population of more than 266,000 patients across several countries, they used a food frequency questionnaire to figure out what people were eating and followed them for about 11 years. And it turns out that if you have more ultra-processed food consumption, one standard deviation increment, or about 260 grams per day, you had 9% more risk of multimorbidity, cancer, and cardiometabolic disease. Remember that many of us are eating out of these highly processed packages every day in large quantities with many more standard deviations above. And so you can imagine that the risk of cancer and cardiometabolic disease goes up drastically. This was another interesting study of female registered nurses from 11 US states, and then some men from the health professionals follow-up study. Again, if you look at highest quartile of consumption of ultra-processed foods, 4% higher all-cause mortality, 9% higher mortality from causes other than cancer. And then if you had meat and poultry and seafood-based, processed meat-based, up to 43% more death. Sugar-sweetened, artificially sweetened beverages, 12% more death. Dairy-based desserts, 10% more death. And ultra-processed breakfast foods, up to 7% more death. And then another interesting study I've shown over the years, as you probably have seen me talk before, that sugar and artificially sweetened beverages seem to be equally dangerous in different ways. But in this interesting study of 201,000 participants followed for about 10 years, if you had 20% more atrial fibrillation with 2 liters per week, which is roughly a can of soda a day. And the highest heart rates of AFib were observed for the patients at the high genetic risk who also consumed 2 liters, but this time it was 351% more. So if you have the genes and you drink a lot of soda, you're in serious trouble. And then we know now, as more research has shown, that artificial sweeteners disrupt the gut microbiome. And remember that when we eat, the very first things we feed, of course, are our gut microbiome. And it turns out that when we switch what we're fueling ourselves with and what kind of chemicals we put in our GI tract, it changes the gut microbiome, which may alter the composition and function of metabolically active microbiome microorganisms with different alterations seen in the stool. So for those of you that haven't seen the documentary on Netflix about twins, I encourage you to check it out. And this was a randomized clinical trial of 22 pairs of twins, so 44 patients. And they were randomized either to a vegan or an omnivorous diet, 1 twin per diet. And they were randomized to follow this diet for 8 weeks. Week 0 to 4, they got meals. 5 to 8, they prepare their own meals. And the twins that were randomized to the vegan diet experienced significant decreases in LDL by about 14 points, fasting insulin levels, and of course, they lost more weight, about 5 pounds. So again, if you're going to compare apples to apples, you might as well look at twins. Results are pretty extraordinary. Now, I work at a hospital that's known significantly for respiratory care, and people are always surprised to learn that COPD, asthma, and other diseases respond positively to diet. But it turns out that when you look at younger participants aged 18 to 30 and follow them for a while, 30 years in this case, it turns out that a greater adherence to a plant-centered diet was inversely associated with emphysema, about a 66% risk reduction. And then there's an interesting study here on coffee. And as you know, most years there are studies out on coffee or tea. This one looked at 8 studies looking at about 432,000 patients. And it turns out that if you were drinking coffee at any amount, you had a reduced likelihood of developing irritable bowel syndrome. Now, as you probably know, blood pressure is becoming more and more in the spotlight since roughly 50% of Americans have high blood pressure. And this was an interesting study in rural China where they randomly assigned 163 villages to a non-physician community health provider-led intervention, and then 163 villages to the usual care. And they took this non-physician healthcare provider and taught them how to titrate medications and follow protocols. And it turns out that those frequent touch points lower blood pressure by about 22 points, which was pretty massive, and then lowers dementia on top of that. Now, for those of you that have heard me talk before, you know that what we eat has a massive effect on our blood pressure. Imagine if they had armed these individuals with lifestyle information in addition to medications. But even further, the more frequent we touch patients and talk to them and put them into an empowering positions, the better they do. This was an interesting analysis of more than 6,500 adults, and they found a clear link between high cardiovascular health as measured by American Heart Association's Life Essential 8 and slower biologic aging. And it turns out that adults who were in the higher category were about 6 years younger biologically than their chronologic age. And many of you who are following this plant-based diet, you probably are hearing your family, friends, peers say, hey, John or Sally, what are you doing? It looks like you've stopped aging. You really can see an effect when people eat better and their body is healing. So one of the very first plant-based diets that came out a long time ago by Dr. Jenkins was this portfolio diet. And in this interesting study of 74,000 women, 44,000 men, they sort of put a portfolio diet score together that ranked how well people were following this diet, and they followed them for 30 years. And as it probably won't come to much surprise to most of this audience, the people who followed this better had a lower total risk of cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke. And then if they had a 25% higher score, they actually lowered cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and stroke as well. And again, the magnitude risk reduction here is pretty powerful, of 14% less, pretty powerful that it's hard to obtain with medications alone. This was an interesting study that came out that's by Dr. Frank Koo talking about dietary strategies for promoting healthy aging. And what they recommend, of course, is reducing chronic inflammation, chronic disease through eating a predominantly plant-based diet, whether it's an Okinawan diet, a Planetary Health diet, a DASH diet, Harvard Healthy Eating Plate, Mediterranean diet, and even the Nordic diet, which has a little bit more fish than you might imagine, but by and large, really powerful ways of getting rid of the junk in the diet and improving health. This was an interesting study that looked at the metabolomic picture that's out there, and participants with a higher healthy lifestyle had 17% lower risk of all-cause mortality, 19% cardiovascular disease, and 25% more likely to reach longevity. And the healthy lifestyle metabolomic signature explained 38% of the association between the self-reported healthy lifestyle score and 49% of the association with longevity. So basically, they created a metabolomic signature for patients that were living healthily, and it explained about half of the reason why they were doing so well. And in order to get this, they looked at a whole variety of different measured biomarkers, but they're looking at healthy diet, physical activity, not smoking, not drinking very much, and having a normal body mass index. They define longevity as living more than 85 years. Another interesting study about red meat, so another 216,000 plus participants. Red meat intakes were assessed by food frequency questionnaire. And when you look at the highest to lowest quintiles, 62% more diabetes with total red meat, 51% for processed red meat, 40% more for diabetes for unprocessed red meat. And if you could substitute 1 serving a day of nuts and legumes for total red meat, you had 30% less diabetes and 41% less diabetes if you were able to sub 1 serving of nuts for processed red meat, unprocessed red meat around 29%. And it turns out that, what was once considered, us in the minority is now spreading to a lot of different specialties. This was a GI doctor here. And it's interesting because typically you don't hear much about GI doctors talking about diet specifically regarding plant-based, but they were. And then you may have seen this, but the American Heart Association actually had a food as medicine presidential advisory. And what did they talk about? The emphasis on fruits and vegetables, whole grains, healthy sources of protein, and eating healthier oils rather than the usual junk that's readily available in the American diet. You may have seen this, but meat consumption hit a record low in the United Kingdom. And people in the UK are consuming the lowest amount of meat since records began in 1974. The government data has revealed that the average quantity of meat an average Brit was consuming was significantly less. Many of you realize that, of course, you can't eat a healthy diet and not live a healthy way because you probably won't maximize that benefit. And it turns out that exercise is pretty magical for a variety of health improvements. In this particular study, which looked at erectile dysfunction, which we already know that diet has a significant impact on, it turns out that when you were able to exercise, you had significant improvements in erectile function. We also know in prostate cancer, and this has been shown many times before, but if you look at a healthful plant diet index, the people who eat better actually had marked improvement for sexual function, urinary function, etc., and even better bowel function, which is also no surprise. This was a really interesting study that came out of Nature, which is one of the more sort of bench researcher journals. And it looked at a significant sort of threshold for the amount of protein. And basically, what they said is that if you are eating protein in excess of 25 grams per meal, it induces this mTOR pathway. And it turns out that this may potentially drive atherosclerosis, particularly in mice. So I think there's a mechanistic basis now for the adverse impact of excessive dietary protein. And so people are just cramming themselves full of protein, and you probably don't need to. Remember, the average person probably needs in the range of 50 grams of protein a day. If you're working out and pretty large, maybe it's 80 or 100, but people are getting much more than that. This was an interesting study of people who passed away with dementia. The mean age of death was 91. And it turns out that for each 1 point increase in healthy lifestyle score, they had fewer units of beta amyloid, so the pathology that shows up with Alzheimer's disease. And lifestyle benefited even if there was already evidence of brain pathology. They thought that about more than 88% of a person's cognitive brain function was directly associated with lifestyle factors, leaving less than 12% related to the presence of this brain pathology, such as beta amyloid. So again, how we eat really has a major effect on one's brain. One of the things we hear often about, particularly in older people, is that they need more protein and that they're going to be malnourished. This was two study cohorts done in Spain, and it turns out that for every 0.25 grams per kilogram intake of animal protein, they had better improved nutritional status when it was from animals. But when you look at plants, it actually made it to 77%. So replacing total animal protein, meat or fish protein, but not dairy or egg, with vegetable improved nutritional status. So bottom line is, if you are elderly, you can eat plants and get all the protein you need and are much more likely to do so. This was an interesting study here about vitamin B. And what it said was that there are some breakdown products of niacin, which is one of the B vitamins, and it suggested an inflammation-dependent mechanism that increases major adverse cardiovascular events. And I've brought this up to you all before, and you may know this, but it turns out that B12, at least in one study some years ago in men, when it was in excess, actually was linked to lung cancer. Now, you may know another thing that's sweeping the United States besides poor diet is an incredible amount of medical debt. And so this is an interesting study that looked at medical debt. And it turns out that the average, on average, 20% of the population holds medical debt. And for every $100 increase in medical debt, there's 8 more days of poor physical health. And if just 1% of a population has medical debt, that's 18 more physically unhealthy days, 18 more mentally unhealthy days, and an extra year of life lost for every 1,000 people. And of course, with all of our crazy billing practices, and I'll be the first to admit it, it is very strange to work in a field where I have no idea what patients are paying for the services they receive. But people are ending up with huge amounts of debt, which creates stress, which creates problems. I was fortunate enough to be able to work with one of a premier group of doctors, and we talked a little bit about the promise of lifestyle medicine for heart disease, diabetes, and cerebrovascular diseases. And we told the audience that lifestyle medicine had great promise for improved population health. However, the adoption at the societal scale requires a multifaceted approach and widespread integration that would galvanize a paradigm shift to prevent, treat, or reverse chronic diseases from the root causes and achieve health equity. A powerful statement. You might be surprised to learn, but it turns out that if you have sidewalks in your neighborhood, you're more likely to be healthy. And this was an interesting study where they took people undergoing calcium scores, which we use to figure out if someone has coronary disease, and used an AI and machine learning approach. And it turns out that people who were living in areas with more sidewalks were 9% less likely to suffer major cardiac events. And people living in places that scored highly for vertical green space, trees, and clear sky were 5% less likely to suffer these events. So it turns out that us earthlings need a healthy earth to thrive. This was an interesting study about music. It turns out that music gives rise to a unique physical sensation in the body, and the strongest heart sensations emerge from a sequence with low surprise in the first 3 chords and high surprise in the final chords. So that's how they're describing some of the classical music. And this pattern's ability to stir stronger heart sensations was directly tied to enhanced pleasure. And us beings are potentially frequency sensitive. And so it's important for us to understand how this may work. Another interesting study about salt, and one of the questions I get all the time is, how much salt should I get? And the answer is less. But in this interesting study here, they looked at a baseline visit while consuming their usual diet. Then they had 1 week of a higher salt diet, around 2,200 milligrams of sodium per day, and then a low sodium diet, about 500 milligrams. And compared with the high sodium and the low sodium diet, that dropped blood pressure in 3/4 of the individuals by about 8 points. And it was similar across subgroups, age, sex, race, hypertension, baseline blood pressure, etc. So it turns out we probably need to eat less salt than we do. Another interesting study about salt here, and we all know people who do this. You probably are sitting next to somebody who likes to salt their food before they even taste it. And it turns out if you're one of those people where you usually add salt to your food, you had 7% more chronic kidney disease. If you always added salt to your food, you had 11% more chronic kidney disease. And these folks were followed for 12 years. But if you compare these folks to those who really or never had salt, that's where this comparison comes from. This was an interesting study in 48 elderly care centers followed for 2 years. They used the salt substitute, and it turns out that the substitute still had sodium in it, but less. And the substitute group actually had 40% less high blood pressure with a net reduction of 8 points. And they had no evidence of low blood pressure. So imagine if we had no added salt at all. Pretty amazing. And another study of 3,100 people, it turns out that these folks already had heart disease. 89% consumed more than the recommended daily maximum of 1,500 milligrams per day. And study participants with cardiovascular disease consumed around 3,100 milligrams per day, which is slightly lower than the national average of 3,400 milligrams per day. And I guess what I would tell you is if you open up your packaged foods and you look at the ingredients, you'll be floored at just how much salt there really is. How about this interesting study? It was looking at a low carbohydrate diet, and I've mentioned this before. If you're going to do a low carbohydrate diet, it's probably safest to do it in a plant-based way. But they look at 5 different diets: a total low carb diet, an animal-based one, a vegetable-based one, a healthy one emphasizing less refined carbs, more plant protein, and an unhealthy low carb diet with more animal protein. And for every 1 standard deviation increase in the very low carbohydrate diets, they had less weight gain. But if they, in the vegetable one, but in the high, healthy low carb diet, they had also less weight gain, but all the other ones gained weight. So in this particular cohort, the vegetable-based and the healthy low carb diet were the ones that help people gain the least amount of weight. And so if you go low carb, do it with plants. Another interesting low carb, high fat diet was defined at less than 100 grams per day or 25% daily energy from carbs. And they looked at a pretty large population, 2,000 individuals, and then 8,000 standard diet folks. And it turns out that the low density cholesterol ApoB were significantly increased in the low carb, high fat diet. After 12 years, 10% of the low carb, high fat diet versus 4.3 of the standard diet had a cardiac event. And this difference remains significant even after adjusting for cardiovascular risk factors, a 218% increased risk. So be wary. You might be surprised to learn that the common root cause for all disease is inflammation. And of course, when we put our bodies in these healthy environments and eat a plant-based diet, we end up with less inflammation. And so therefore, it should be no surprise that arthritis responds. And this interesting study that was followed, where they followed folks for 11 years, they had significantly improved pain scores in people who followed a plant-based diet. This was an interesting one. This was a Mendelian randomization analysis using UK Biobank data. And it turns out that exposure to elevated cholesterol, LDL, or high blood pressure in folks who were under 55 led to significant problems later in life. So for every 39 points higher LDL, 68% more coronary disease later in life. And for every 10 millimeters higher blood pressure, 33% more coronary disease later in life. So it turns out that our cumulative exposure to sort of badness is what leads to poor outcomes. So this was an interesting study also where they looked at about 3,000 individuals and tried to figure out when they should eat and figure out when their glycemic load was the highest, whether it was in an early morning, late morning, et cetera. And it turns out that energy intake and glucose glycemic load in the late morning were inversely associated with cardiovascular disease mortality. And if you were more likely to eat later at night, you actually had up to 44% more cardiovascular disease mortality. So in general, I always tell people to try to eat their breakfast a little bit later in the morning. There's something beneficial about fasting, as you may know, and then stop eating earlier in the evening. And so a lot of people will say this is time restricted eating, or commonly known as intermittent fasting. And there's more and more data suggesting that there may be significant benefits from doing that. There was an umbrella review that showed that vegetarian and vegan diets are significantly associated with better lipid profile, glycemic control, body weight, inflammation, and lower risk of ischemic heart disease and cancer. And of course, no surprise, but these are nice to see when they put all these studies together, what they come up with. This was an interesting study of about 25,000 women followed for about 25 years from the Women's Health Study. It turns out that higher adherence to the Mediterranean diet was associated with about a 23% reduced risk of all-cause mortality. And as you may know, a Mediterranean diet is a predominantly plant-based diet. Remember that the American take on a Mediterranean diet is not a Mediterranean diet at all. So if you're eating a giant pile of, feta and lamb, and you're not seeing a plate full of greens and beans, you're probably not eating a real Mediterranean diet. And if you want to live longer, and I've mentioned this in years past, shift to a plant-based diet. It turns out that eating more whole grains and legumes, drinking fewer sugar-sweetened beverages, actually can increase life expectancy by up to 7 years. You might be surprised to learn also gout, another inflammatory condition. The better you eat, the less gout you have. But if you eat an unhealthy plant-based diet, you actually had more gout. So remember that if you're a junk food vegan, and these days it is sure easier than ever to do so with cupcakes and processed baked goods and candies. I mean, there's a version of a vegan version of every food you might have ever wanted that was not vegan. And many of these are largely unhealthy. So be careful, because it could potentially trigger gout. So this was a really interesting study. So they had 3 groups of genetically determined lifespan categories. So they could tell based on genes who was more likely to live longer or shorter. And participants with a genetic predisposition to a short lifespan and who lived an unfavorable lifestyle were 2 times more likely to die. An unfavorable lifestyle had a 78% increased risk of death compared with a favorable lifestyle within and across the genetic categories. So the authors conclude that an adherence to a healthy lifestyle could largely attenuate the genetic risk of a shorter lifespan or premature death. So the genetic risk of a shorter lifespan or premature death might be offset by a favorable lifestyle by approximately 62%, adding around 5 years to life. So as you've heard me before, genes don't have to hold you hostage. It's really about the environment you put those genes in. Now, there's still more data coming out about COVID. This was an interesting study of 702 participants. And they looked at those that were omnivorous and plant-based, and after adjusting for confounders such as body mass index, the plant-based diet group had 39% lower odds of the incidence of COVID-19 infection. The vegetarian group, 39% lower odds overall. And it's also never too late. In this interesting EPIC cohort of about 300,000 middle-aged patients, each had a healthy lifestyle index score based on cigarette smoking, alcohol consumption, body mass index, and physical activity. And then they estimated the association between risk of lifestyle-related cancers, including breast, lung, colorectum, and stomach, liver, cervix, esophagus, etc. And those in the bottom third at follow-up had 21% higher risk of lifestyle-related cancers. And among participants in the bottom third at baseline, those in the top third at follow-up, so that means that you have the ability to redeem yourself, had 25% less lower lifestyle-related cancers. So remember that the United States now has some of the fastest growing rates of colorectal cancer amongst young people, and a lot of it has to do with our dietary habits. So in general, if we can change out of them, it's never too late. And then this was an interesting study here. And as you know, more and more of the data has now pointed to alcohol being really largely unhelpful in every way. And so this was a study that followed about 280,000 white British participants for about 12 and a half years. And it turns out that the more you drink, the more you die. And for each standard unit increase in alcohol, there was a nearly 30% increased risk of all-cause mortality, cardiovascular disease, 20% risk of cancer, and 106% increase in digestive disease mortality. So consider drinking less or none. This was interesting. For those of you that have any influence over cafeteria choices, it turns out that if you go to a university setting and you set up the station in each cafeteria station to have an experiment where you put the plant-based default and the signage lists options, and it follows the meat dish, which was available upon request only. And they only showed the vegan dish with the meat dish kept in a separate location and retrieved when it was requested. The vegan default intervention was able to reduce meat consumption by nearly 60% and increased vegan meals by selections by 60% at the cafeteria stations with the intervention. So it turns out that if you can prepare a dish that looks beautiful, people will choose it. This was a randomized control crossover study. 30 healthy older adults are assigned to either 48 hours of a vegan or omnivorous diet. Insulin concentrations, insulin resistance decline only after the vegan diet and within 2 days, believe it or not. Another study on colorectal cancer. Young onset patients had a lower intake of vegetables and fruit and higher intake of processed meat and spicy food by about 40, and they had about 40% more odds of cancer. Another study out of Finland, 44,000 participants, mostly men. Again, food frequency questionnaire to look at the diet, followed for about 30 years. When red meat was substituted with vegetables, 3% reduction in cancer. Whole grains, vegetables, and fruits combined, 3% reduction. And for processed meat, these substitutions had a 1% risk reduction. So even small, easily implemented substitutions of red or processed meat with whole grains, vegetables, and fruits could lower colorectal cancer risk. Another study out of the cardia cohort, 526 participants, after adjustment for demographics, education, et cetera. Highest versus lowest tertile sleep fragmentation index had almost 3 times the odds of worsened cognitive performance 10 years later. So it turns out that when we have a fragmented sleep or interrupted sleep, it actually, and especially when it's chronic, it has a significant impact on how your brain functions years later. This was an interesting study of 16 different studies put together and pooled. If you sleep less than 7 hours, you had a 7% increased risk of developing high blood pressure and up to 11% when reported sleep duration was less than 5 hours. Now, this one I thought was pretty fascinating, but they looked at studies that were 50 to 64, randomly recruited under one extensive examination, and they looked at them and their accelerometry assessed physical activity, so they had a little device that measured it. And it turns out that if you were an evening chronotype, which means that you are a night owl, you had significantly increased risk of coronary artery calcium compared to extreme morning type by 90%. So for those of you early birds, keep it going. And you can see here that if you look at the extreme evening versus the extreme morning, significant decrease in the likelihood of coronary artery calcium. Another interesting study, 407,000 men and women, again, food frequency questionnaire, dietary assessments, and a greater intake of plant fat had up to 12% less cardiovascular disease, higher consumption of total animal fat, 16% more cardiovascular disease. This was an interesting one. I hear this all the time. I hate soy milk. Why would I drink it? Well, it turns out cow's milk is probably not only super bad for you, but also has effects on cardiovascular risk factors. It turns out that when you can switch it, people have significant drops in blood pressure by about 8 points. They have significant drops in their cholesterol, and C-reactive protein, a measure of inflammation, drops also significantly. This was an interesting study here where participants were measured with adhesion to the general patterns of the Mediterranean diet, again, a historical plant-based Mediterranean diet. And when they change from the traditional to the vegan Mediterranean diet, so again, they switched from a traditional Mediterranean diet to an isocaloric, which means the same number of calories, vegan version, and they had a 7-day washout between the diets, you still achieved a drop in cholesterol and LDL. And realize that the vast majority of people on a Mediterranean diet compared to a standard American diet already have a drop in cholesterol. And when you go into the vegan or the green version of the Mediterranean diet, they do even better. So I'm always impressed when I see things about plant-based advocacy in the mainstream media. This one came from The Week magazine. And this was the lonely fight of the radical vegans, and the tactics of vegan activists make a lot of people uncomfortable. And so should the plight of animals trapped in America's factory farms. And I think that's a really powerful statement that, you know, we really should figure out where our food comes from so that we are just as uncomfortable as they might be. As the service line director in my institution, I always get the Cardiovascular Business Journal. This came out one day. I was surprised to see. that diet was at the top of the list. And of course, Mediterranean, DASH, et cetera, were all some of the best. And of course, if you look at this list of diets, almost all of them are predominantly plant-based diets, no surprise. The UN chief may have said this, you don't know if you saw this, but the world is on a highway to climate hell as the planet endures 12 straight months of unprecedented heat. Record-breaking temperatures recorded across the globe in 2023 without climate action. Adverse climate-related health impacts are expected to worsen, affecting billions of people. Climate change is not in the far future, it's here and it kills. This was a really interesting one. For those of you that are using cell phones, and I imagine that's probably all of us, they follow people for about 12 years, and compared with non-regular phone users, regular mobile phone users had a higher risk of cardiovascular disease by 4%. And it was worse in smokers and diabetics, believe it or not. And then, of course, what's good for us is also good for the planet. And this interesting study that looked at a pretty large cohort from the Nurses' Health Study and the Health Professionals Follow-Up Study, plant-based healthy dietary index was calculated every 4 years. And it turns out that when you are comparing the highest to the lowest quintile of the plant-based healthy dietary index, up to a third less mortality. These are numbers you can't achieve with medicines alone. And believe it or not, interestingly, 47% lower risk of death from respiratory diseases. And then this was interesting. This came out of the European Society of Cardiology. If you haven't seen it, worth taking a look. And what they said here is the global phenomenon of an aging population compounded by the pervasive pandemic of abdominal obesity, metabolic diseases stemming from unhealthy lifestyles presents a formidable challenge. These trends not only escalate healthcare costs, but strain the sustainability of our healthcare systems. And simply increasing spending is not a viable solution. And then this underscores the urgent need to transition towards preventative healthcare and educational models rather than predominantly address.
Diagnosis here.
Someone talking. An urgent need to transition towards preventative healthcare and educational models rather than predominantly addressing chronic conditions reactively within hospital settings. Very powerfully worded. I was very impressed by this. You may have seen this, the nice review in New England Journal of Medicine, which is the country's top medical journal, all about diet. And what do they say? Whoops. They say that although many diets have been developed with the initial aim of controlling body weight, dietary composition has important health effects. An overall inspection of literature suggests that plant-based diets, characterized by the consumption of fruits and vegetables, etc., lead to substantial health benefits. And educating health professionals about these diets is powerful. And then I was fortunate enough to be part of this group of writers about food as medicine, the time is now. And basically we talk about how every professional society now endorses a plant-based diet and the plan is food as medicine. So bottom line, after all of this giant review for the last 45 minutes, success is a low-fat, 100% whole grain, minimally processed plant-based diet. And if you don't believe me, maybe you'll believe Albert Einstein, who said that nothing will benefit our society than the evolution to a vegetarian diet. Encourage you to check out some of the things we do. We have a great program called Walk with a Doc, which in some areas you may have as well. We have a Transitioning the Plant-Based Support Group, which you all can attend, which meets virtually on Zoom. And you can find it on the National Jewish webpage or reach out to this email address that's on the slide. And of course, if you're not convinced, I always encourage people to do their own research and ask questions, because a lot of what you've been told or thought you knew may not be fully accurate. And with that, I've left a few minutes for questions.
Andrew, thank you so much. Holy mackerel, that's outstanding. I'm sure most everybody here is probably familiar with Dr. Greger. This was like Dr. Greger on steroids as far as the amount of information in a short period of time here, just one after another. And it does such an excellent job in confirming what so many of you are probably already doing, and that's trying to eat as healthy as you can. You just have the potential for a much higher quality of life, a longer life, and every day better than it would be otherwise. Let me jump to the questions here. So let's see if I can find one. So Janet mentions, are there any studies about no oil consumption and any benefit from no oil consumption?
Yeah, so again, this is just the last year's worth of data. So, depending on who you follow, you may know my good friend, Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn, or S for short. He would tell you to never have any oil. If you press him hard enough, you might he might agree to a couple walnut halves in a day. But in general, there is some research suggesting that oil might interfere with endothelial cell function. There's also some evidence that oil may have some benefits, but only certain types. So what I usually tell my patients, particularly those that are at highest risk, is to really limit or avoid oil altogether if they can. It's also highly caloric. So in general, you should probably check with your doc and see what they say. But it is certainly a divisive point in the plant-based community about whether any oil is okay or not. And I think the data to date suggests that certain oils are probably beneficial, but avoiding the tropical oils is probably the most important. Coconut and palm and others are all considered tropical.
And the next question is along that line, and I think you answered it already, but Gary says, if you have mild cardiovascular disease, should you avoid olive oil?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Most oils, if you look at them, you have to take like a teeny tiny seed and put it under enormous pressure and heat to get even a drop of oil out. And then, of course, some of the processing actually can unintentionally strip out antioxidants and important nutrients. Olive oil is unique in that you can sort of squeeze an olive and get some oil out of it. And so, the question is that safe? And again, I would put out that, again, it's all how it's processed. As you may know, a lot of olive oil in the United States is not prepared the way it is, say, in Europe, or where there's more olive producing regions of the world. So in general, what I usually give people is the very same advice, if they're very high risk, to limit it. And then if you have to choose an oil, olive oil is probably the one that has the most evidence that it may be safe. But again, I wouldn't be drinking it in liters a day.
And one more oil one here, Sherry. What about someone with elevated LPA? Is that lipids I mentioned? Is a
Yeah,
small
yes.
amount of olive oil okay?
Yeah, so lipoprotein A, for those of you that are not familiar, I encourage you to get this checked. So 1 in 5 people worldwide has it. It's associated with early heart disease and early heart valvular disease. Again, 1 in 5 people, which means, something like 30 or 40 people on this call probably have high lipoprotein A. And excitingly, for the first time in history, there'll be a drug that's targeting it, specifically available in about 10 months, and it's 90% genetic. So what you eat really doesn't have a major effect on lipoprotein A. But I would encourage everybody to at least get a screening for it. And then if you have it, we typically, besides an amazingly positive, healthy lifestyle like we're talking about today, many times for now, until that drug becomes available, we're putting people on specific cholesterol medications and actually even an aspirin. Some people colloquially refer to lipoprotein A as sticky cholesterol, and we usually recommend an aspirin to reduce some of the stickiness that's associated.
Warren mentions cow's milk is super bad for you. Thank you for saying this. We Wisconsinites need to have the courage to say that out loud. I don't know if you know this, Dr. Freeman, but on our license plate it says America's Dairyland. So
Yes. So I would tell you, yes, just because of your culture, it doesn't need to hold you hostage, is a great saying from Kim Williams. And the truth is, if you think about what we do, we get together with friends and family for holidays and celebrations, and we poison each other, right? Think about how much ham gets consumed every Thanksgiving or Christmas or New Year's or whatever it is, and we know it to be as cancer-causing as cigarettes. And of course, if we started distributing cigarettes around the table, people might look at us strangely. And so the same goes with foods that we know that are probably dangerous. So dairy is associated with a variety of issues, namely it's one of the highest sources of saturated fat in the American diet, but it also appears to be quite inflammatory and contains a number of compounds in it that seem to be bad for human health, which may be why it's linked to breast and prostate cancer. So my suggestion is to avoid it. And if you really need to have a cheese, they now make all sorts of artisanal non-dairy cheeses, some of which that are even made in Wisconsin, believe it or not. And again, that's not that they're health food, but they are certainly better than the original.
and my question would be, again, as you mentioned, it's not healthy, but and it's not something I would encourage people to do. But the Brewers last night were looking at cheese curds and talking about cheese curds, which is, of course, a big Wisconsin thing. So
Yes.
I imagine there are vegan cheese curds out there someplace.
Like I said, I would tell you that you can Google and find a vegan version of anything if you look hard enough. And if you can't find it locally, you'll usually find a recipe for it. So I think I think the last remaining vegan food challenge that was solved in the last 5 years was how to make a meringue. And it turns out that you can take the sort of juice off of chickpeas and whip it up and it will make a meringue.
I should ask you before going to the next question, if you have 2 or 3 favorite vegan dishes.
Yeah, I think, in general, I would tell you this, particularly this time of year, you may not know this but Colorado is known for peaches. And we have so many different varieties of peaches, you'd be blown away. But one of my favorite things is not a dish at all, but simply what's called a mango donut peach, which is an incredibly weird looking peach that's flat and yellow, but it is unbelievably good. So that's my favorite. But I would say otherwise, I like lots of things. My favorite is ethnic food. So here in Denver, we have a surprisingly amazing ethnic population and therefore good ethnic foods. And my favorite really is typically Indian or Thai. Whenever I can, I try to get a chana masala, which is a spiced chickpea dish. And then the other thing I really like is a masaman curry, which is a Thai curry that's typically peanut and potato and vegetable based.
Excellent. Larry says, I don't understand reduced mortality. Does it mean earlier mortality?
Yes. Yeah. So for clarity, yes, we're all dying. And I'm sorry to tell you that truth, but yes, we are. The goal is to die less, early, that's for sure. Really, the ultimate goal of what I'm trying to do is spread a message to avoid what I call the American curse, which, as you may know, is alive and well in many parts of our country, including Wisconsin, which is you work hard your whole life, you save your money, you get ready to retire, and then you don't just get to die, but you get to suffer with heart attacks, strokes, dementia, erectile dysfunction, and poor quality of life. And it turns out that most of those are actually quite avoidable if we can pivot before they come on. And so that's really what it's all about. And so I would argue it's one thing to be alive, it's another to be alive and well. And that's really what this is about.
Excellent. I have heard the quote, the objective is to die young as late as possible.
Right.
Let's see. Lori says, do you have a general guide for men and women for fiber intake?
My general guide is to eat as much as you can when it comes to fiber, and that comes by eating fruits and vegetables. And I don't think it's a nutrient of concern if you eat lots of fruits and vegetables. So every meal you consume every day should contain lots of fruits and vegetables. You'll never have to worry about it again. I usually tell people that if you're pooping at least once a day and ideally twice or even 3 times a day, you're eating enough fiber.
And Warren mentions, don't most of the vegan cheeses contain lots of salt and processed oil?
They do. I am not endorsing or recommending plant-based cheeses, but if you said to me, I need a piece of cheese, I'd recommend you eat a plant-based version.
That sounds great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Freeman. I realize you're on a time crunch here, and thanks for doing this. I hope you can come back next year. We really look forward to this review every year.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. And for those of you that are interested, we have one of the biggest veg fests in the country. I'll be speaking again in September here in Colorado and Denver. It's a great time of year to visit. So,
well, that's excellent. Well, thanks again, Doctor.
All right, be well, everyone. Take care.
Now I'm going to look here to see if Dr. Liberman is here. I think actually I was contacting him during the talk here, and it looked like he is still tied up at the office based on his earlier start time. I think.
I'm here. I'm here now.
Oh, you are there? Okay. So let me quickly introduce Dr. Liberman here. Our last speaker tonight is a fellowship-trained cardiologist. He's president and CEO of Wisconsin Cardiology Associates, which he's working very hard at today. He's a past president and current trustee of the Wisconsin chapter of the American College of Cardiology, and he's a member of the American College of Cardiology's National Nutrition and Lifestyle Work Group, who Dr. Freeman used to head, and whose membership includes nationally known physicians such as Dr. Dean Ornish, Dr. Neil Bernard, and Dr. Caldwell Esselstyn. He's an advocate for the use of plant-based nutrition to help improve heart health, general health, and quality of life, and has seen the benefits of plant-based nutrition in both his personal life and that of his patients. We're fortunate to have him here in Milwaukee and as our PBNL medical director. I'm happy to welcome Dr. Joshua Liberman. Dr. Liberman?
Yeah, thanks, Terry, as always. Sorry, usually, we have it flipped, but obviously with Dr. Freeman's schedule requirements, we decided to do it inverted or the out of the typical pattern. And so I get you at the end of the talk. Usually in this situation, I like to, talk when I'm introducing, the night. I like to talk about some experiences from my own clinical practice of patients that have had a lot of success with plant-based diets, but I also like to talk about a recent study that supports plant-based eating. Well, I don't want to be, repetitive or redundant. I mean, Dr. Freeman obviously just went through a whole lot of studies as he usually does, and so I think there's not necessarily any need to rehash a lot of that stuff. But I do think it might be beneficial just to illustrate that this stuff doesn't work just in a clinical, like, research environment, and it's not just population based, which is what I mean. But what I mean by that is, if you look at whole populations of people and say that this population eating a healthy diet versus this population eating an unhealthy diet, the population eating a healthy diet are going to be healthier, right? And that makes intuitive sense. But you have to understand that, within populations, people can have varied results. Some people have a more aggressive response, some people have a minimal response. And so you have to be a little bit careful of the tension between what's good for an individual or what works for an individual and what works for a population. So that's where I think, the transition from Dr. Freeman's talk about lots of population-based studies and what works in populations to what I see in my patients on a daily basis. And so in the last week, I've had two patients that, that really I wanted to highlight at this talk, because both of them really illustrate the changes that you can, the success you can have when you make a change in your lifestyle. And so one patient I saw earlier this week, 60 years old, a woman, diagnosed with heart disease on the basis of one of these calcium score tests that a lot of people have been getting, and certainly I recommend for appropriate people. And her calcium score test wasn't extremely high, but for her age, only 60, it put her actually in the 95th percentile. So obviously, that's not a great situation, and she was highly motivated to make some changes. For most of her life, she's wanted to avoid medication. Before she met me, she went on, her primary care doctor put her on some medication, and sure enough, her cholesterol got better. Her cholesterol dropped from 141 earlier in the year to about 92 in spring, and that's a pretty nice response. But for most people, especially people who are high risk, who have a lot of plaque, way more plaque than we want them to have, we try to get their cholesterol down even lower. The current recommendations for higher risk people are to get their LDLs, their bad cholesterols, down below 70 if we can. And we actually do have really good research that shows that if you can get your numbers down even into the 50s, your LDL into the 50s, you can actually reverse plaque or melt plaque away. Well, she was already somewhat reluctant to go on medication in the first place, so that wasn't going to be my first choice to add more medication to her to drive her number down. So when she met me, we talked about the potential benefits of moving to a more plant-based diet. And again, we reviewed some of the research, we reviewed the benefits, and she decided that that's what she wanted to do, because it was going to prevent her, hopefully, from having to go on even more medication to get to her goal. Because again, as I said, her LDL had dropped from 141 to 92, but I really, for her, because of her risk level, wanted it less than 70. So sure enough, in May, she decided to go completely plant-based, and I just saw her back at her 3-month visit this past week. And drum roll, her LDL was down to 35. All right, so she, with lifestyle alone, with moving to a plant-based diet alone, dropped her LDL from 92 to 35, which is a profoundly powerful, dramatic response, and frankly, not that surprising when people really make the change, when they make the commitment to go to a completely plant-based diet. So that was a really great result for her. We were very happy, and of course, she, you can imagine, was extremely proud of herself. Because the magnitude of the change that she achieved was even more than what she got with medication alone. So highly motivating for her to keep going and to stay healthy for hopefully another 30 to 40 years. Similarly, another patient I saw, this lady was 69 years old. She's had a long history of some heart issues. She got a bad virus actually about 10 years ago that weakened her heart. This was before COVID, so it had nothing to do with that. But she had a bad virus that weakened her heart, and she's been working with the cardiology establishment for about 10 years since then. But established with me earlier this year, and again, had one of these calcium scores that showed that it was a lot higher than we wanted it to be for her. She's a little bit older. Her score was older, but she was also in the 95th percentile. And again, similar situation, different patient. Her bad cholesterol was not where we want it to be. We now wanted to try to attack that. She was, again, similarly not super interested in being on medication, but she was able to achieve dramatic benefits in terms of her cholesterol. Her LDL, again, going completely plant-based, without any medication at all. So she, again, this is a lady who did not want to go on medication. She just wanted to see if she could lower her cholesterol first with going to a plant-based diet. Her LDL dropped from 143 down to 85. Again, is 85 perfect? No, but boy, that's pretty darn good. That's a significant improvement without medication in her LDL and her overall risk. So, we talked about ways to lower that even further, and we're going to give it some time. But again, you can imagine how empowering this is to know that by changing our lifestyles, we can really dramatically improve our health. Right. So these are, two obviously special stories. They just happened to both come in 1 week, and they were both really, encouraging. We get other patients that are not ready to quite make those changes or don't believe that we can achieve that kind of change. I literally just walked out of the room of a patient about half an hour ago who really didn't believe that changing diet could help at all. She's very discouraged about her health in general and about the possibilities. I've tried every diet kind of stuff and nothing has worked. And so, we'll work over time and see if we can migrate her into a different mindset where she's a little bit more open to really making some significant change. So not every story is a perfect story, but there were two that I wanted to highlight to show that that on an individual basis, we see the results that you can also see in these population-based studies that Dr. Freeman was talking about.
Boy, those examples are just amazing. It's just remarkable what can happen. And I'm sure their cholesterol numbers and lipid and those numbers were not the only thing that improved for them.
Oh yeah, no doubt. I mean, there's no question that, and I do talk about this with patients, and I appreciate you pointing that out, that, the good news about plant-based diets is they don't just help cholesterol, right? They help sugars, they help inflammation, they help a lot of different things. And so, whereas some people could elect to go on a medication rather than, than changing their lifestyle, that medication is going to fix the one problem that medication is designed for. So you go on a cholesterol medication, it's going to fix your cholesterol, but it won't do anything about improving your sugars or your blood pressure or your inflammation. Well, some medicines can help with inflammation, but the point is that, rather than use, 5 different bullets for 5 different problems, you can use, one weapon, forgive the analogy, that takes care of all those problems. And so that's really where the benefit of changing lifestyle comes in.
Thanks again to Dr. Liberman and our featured speaker, Dr. Andrew Freeman, for sharing their valuable time and knowledge with us tonight. Thanks for coming, everybody. Good night, and hope you can join us next time.